Today we're going to talk about defense, and there's no better defensive faction than the Skaven. Well, that might not be true, but I do like the Skaven. I'm not going to talk about the Skaven specifically too much, though. We're going to talk about general defensive concepts. Defensive playstyles means you're forcing your opponent into you, and what that means is you need to outrange them. So depending on who your opponent is, you need to select what range you're operating at. For example, if you're fighting Beastmen, and they might very likely vanguard upon you, you probably don't need artillery because they'll be right in front of you. You want to stick to mid-range threats or just archer-ranged threats. Again, speaking about every faction, not just Skaven. If your opponent is going to kite you, you might need artillery. Artillery is generally the counter to kite because it can draw the opponent in since they cannot possibly outrange your artillery. So knowing your opponent is knowing what sort of ranged carry assets you need. Now, if you're playing a defensive style, you almost always have a ranged carry asset. If you're playing defensive and melee, you have lost all agency in the game, and it's probably not going to work at the mid to high tiers of play. It might work against someone on quick battles who's had a couple beers and is just having a good time, but then you're in a blob and you also are not having very much fun. So, if you're sticking to defensive playstyle, you need ranged carry potential. When you're dealing with ranged carry potential, again, it's about which opponent you're fighting and what your range potential needs to do. So for the Skaven, taking this actual example, Boys Wing Globes are good at taking out if your opponent's trying to kill you through crushing you with a rush of infantry, or not as much cavalry anymore, but a little bit cavalry. If your opponent's going to be single entity or flying based, you'll probably want Jazales or Rattling Guns. So knowing the ranged unit you need for the moment is important. Roughly, if a unit is straight firing, like a gun. If it is a gun and it fires in a straight line, you need to shoot it at cavalry that has not hit your front line yet, or tall single entities or flying units. Guns are terrible at killing infantry, just terrible at it. You can get a couple volleys off, sure, but then when the front line starts, you can't see them anymore. So guns are not to kill infantry. It's just never been true in Total War. Archers kill infantry. Archers or lobbed projectiles kill infantry. So if the threat is infantry or cavalry after it's into melee combat, you're going to need some lobbed projectiles if you want to hit them at all. Now, lobbed projectiles are pretty bad at taking out lords in most cases, so if you're trying to lord snipe again, you might want to use the guns. It's all about knowing what you're trying to hit. As for artillery, generally catapult-type units are good against infantry and other artillery pieces, while single-shot artillery are good against cavalry and monsters. That is a general rule of thumb. It differs from artillery piece to artillery piece. The last real build perspective you're going to want, well, I guess there are two things. In most factions, in most cases, you're going to want about 3 melee units to every 1 ranged unit. Generally. The only other way you could play it is if you're playing Kite, but that's not really defensive. Kite's kind of its own thing. But anyway. You need that many infantry to protect each ranged unit, and some people will be like, well, if I just take enough ranged units, I can just kill stuff. That almost never works. That just almost never works. Ranged has a hard time protecting ranged unless you're Anticity, and that requires a stupid amount of skill. Generally, you just want to have enough bodies between you and the opponent. An important thing about those bodies, is the last thing I was going to mention, is you need different sizes of units. If you have all infantry, cavalry can literally just run through you. This is something that dwarves do struggle with, which is why they normally have slayers. Monstrous infantry or cavalry of your own are a must. If a flying monster lands like Bellicor or something, you need to be able to surround them in mass and get your ranged units away. Infantry just can't do that. Dragons can path through infantry, cavalry can path through infantry, chariots can path through infantry. You need big boys. So, that's important when you're making a build. Alrighty, when you're setting up a defensive deployment, I probably didn't pick the best map for this, but alright. You usually want to go with a checkerboard kind of style, and by that I mean, you know, don't have your units so clumped up that supporting them, look how much less, like, these 6 units cover. But you leave spaces between the front line, just a bit, not a lot, about half the length, roughly, thumbnail of the unit standing on its own. And the secondary line can be in between here And the problem for your opponent is, I don't have my markers, dang it. If they try to walk through here and just ignore you, it's not like you're AFK. You can just order, both of these units to come attack it, and then it's surrounded on 3 sides. So they kind of have to go through your front line, otherwise they're just going to get surrounded. So you do want to deploy in checkerboard, have your reserves filling in the gap behind your front line, and then your back line within a range that they can shoot in front of your front line a little bit and also shoot your front line at the same time to support when in melee combat. If you deploy it too far back, you obviously can't support your front line, and then they're fighting alone. Again, this map's a little smaller. Should have picked a different one, but oh well, we're here. Artillery usually wants to be separated a little bit in case, like, let's say this one on the right gets obliterated by cav, the other one on the left can keep firing, and I can remove something between it and the obstacle to keep it safe. If they are right next to each other, if this one gets compromised, the other one's going to get compromised in a couple seconds. Right. And the last thing I will say is you usually want your mobile elements on your flanks to counter other mobile elements or chase off anything. And the decision of when to keep your mobile elements next to your shooting and when to run them around to the enemy is assessing the enemy's range strength. So I'm going to unblob this a little bit so it doesn't look so crazy. If you have a wolf rat and a rat ogre on each side in this example, and your opponent has no archers, there's no reason for your wolf rats and rat ogres to run around the enemy line and get a rear charge, because you're not trying to beat them in melee, you're trying to defend your own ranged assets. Those will win you the game. If the enemy, if you load into the game and strangely the enemy has 5 Warp Lightning Cannons and you only have 2, then your mobile assets have to go compromise their ranged assets because you're going to lose the ranged fights. Your ranged units don't matter anymore at that point. It doesn't matter. You're going to lose the ranged fight. You need to change the rules that the battlefield's being played on. Let your ranged units shoot. Maybe leave a Skaven slave or like a peasant or something like your lowest tier infantry with them just to defend them from like dogs. But in general, your whole force has to turn to a rush at that point if you're getting outshot. So even if you intended to be defensive, if you're getting outshot, you got to get aggressive because you're just not going to win a defensive position at all. Other than that, your cavalry or mobile elements or monstrous infantry, any of that, should not leave your ranged assets unless absolutely necessary. If the enemy has a bunch of archers maybe and you have artillery, the wolf rats could go a little crazy and try to get some archers or just sneak around, but the rat ogres have to stay home. They have to. Otherwise, why did you bring ranged assets if you're not going to protect them? You know what I mean? So it is tempting. It is tempting sometimes where you see like cavalry that your rat ogres can do a bunch of damage to or your monstrous infantry can do a bunch of damage to. But if you leave your ranged assets, you're leaving your true carry potential behind to get sniped out by manticores or dogs or anything like that. So yeah, it's important to remember how you're going to win the game. And it's like, okay, my ranged assets are going to win the game. My mobile assets have to protect them. My mobile assets don't have to shut down the enemy. Okay? That's a general how-to of defensive deployment. The last thing I'll mention is when to box and when not to box. If you are completely outmatched in the mobile game, you just have no hope of winning it. You do need to use infantry to cover your flanks and stay in between any angle and your ranged assets. If you have more mobile assets than the enemy, you should make your front line deeper and rely on your mobile assets to control the sides with cycle charging and such. Hope that was helpful in some fashion. Roar! Subscribe, yes.